All right. We are beginning our Revelation study this morning. As I mentioned, even though we had a little bit of issues getting everything printed this morning, so they weren't on the table probably when y'all came in, but the next 2 sheets of notes to be able to slide into your binders are on the back table. If you don't have them yet, you can pick them up after class or after worship. It'll be a second part to the introduction, and then the first half of Revelation 1, verses 1 through 8, are the notes, and there's questions attached to Revelation 1, verses 1 through 8 on the back of those pages. Those are front and back, 2 pages. So beginning here, this is kind of like a little foreword talking about numbers in Revelation. So obviously there's a whole lot of misunderstanding and misinformation in our society, especially religious society, about Revelation. And it's important for us to understand that the majority of Revelation is not meant to be taken literally in the imagery that it conveys, but it does have meaning. And so some of those meanings involve numbers, and there's a whole lot of false teachings based around some of the numbers in Revelation, like 144,000 is one of the kind of ones maybe pops into our head immediately. There's some religions that kind of base their whole belief that there's only 144,000 that are going to be saved. And so understanding the meaning of those numbers, which is something we're all familiar with. You know, if we say 911, we understand that's in America, that's how you dial emergency services. Whereas you say 9/11 and you think of, you know, the tragedy in the World Trade Center and so forth. So numbers carry meaning, it carries symbolism, even in our society, and it did for them as well, going all the way back to the Old Testament. And that's one of the things we're going to notice. There's over 400 allusions, if not direct quotes or references, to Old Testament in the book of Revelation. It is full of Old Testament references. In fact, it's not intended this way, but it's actually kind of a fortuitous and serendipitous that Nolan is going through the minor prophets on Wednesday nights, because there's a lot of minor prophet references in Revelation as well. And so understanding how these things associate together and understanding how numbers are used, not by man, but by God, how God conveys certain things with these numbers, is going to be very important. For instance, 1. 1 is not the loneliest number, as Terry and I were talking about this morning before class. But 1 in the Bible refers to God being one, the ultimate unity. Of course, we have one of God, which is, there's 3, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but they are one in purpose. In Genesis chapter 2 and in verse 24, which is also quoted in the New Testament, how that the man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. They are united together. We see that mentioned in Matthew 19. Paul references it in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, how that Jesus took both the Jew and the Gentile. He made both one. And so obviously it carries on John chapter 17, verses 20 and 21, where Jesus is praying this prayer on behalf of his apostles and disciples. He prays to God that his disciples would be one in him, and he in them, and Christ, and so forth. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, of course we talked, I guess it's been a month and a half or 2 ago, about God is one, and what that means. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And understanding that unity of purpose, understanding that in order to be a part of that unity of God, we have to abide by his will, which is the very thing that Moses called on Israel to do in Deuteronomy chapter 6. The statement that God is one is not a numerical count, but a statement of ultimate unity. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16, that in particular it's more of a physical reference, but Paul quotes from Genesis chapter 2 regarding a husband and a wife becoming one flesh. And so 1 carries that sense with it. And when we read through Revelation, when we go through these numbers, we need to keep these meanings in the back of our minds, because that's going to be conveyed in Revelation, some of this meaning with these numbers. Thoughts or comments through 1? Yes, sir.
This made me think of 1 Corinthians 1, where he talks about unity. He doesn't use the word one, but there be no division among you, would be the same idea as being
one. Yeah. One, united together, and that's in purpose and in faith and in the teaching of the gospel. Absolutely. Yeah.
Telling what it's not helps explain it.
Yes.
Like what you said, no division, that helps explain what it's not.
Right. Right. And that's an important thing to note as well, because there are times especially in Revelation, where there are, for instance, there is for those of you who've read, in fact, the first, really, our introduction kind of deals a little bit with the first 3 verses of Revelation. But in those first 3 verses, what number is clear from verses 4 through 7? It's 3. Okay, that number 3 is clear in verses 4 through 7 of Revelation. And yet John never uses that term. And yet we have God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. All 3 are mentioned in those first couple or handful of verses of Revelation chapter 1. And so that's a great point, is that sometimes the number itself may not be used, but the representation of it is. So like, we have the 7 churches of Asia in chapter 2 and chapter 3. 7 certainly is an important number. But you'll have repetitions sometimes as well that carries that same type of understanding of meaning. Anything else through 1? All right, 2. Usually 2 represents the concept of testimony, witness. Genesis chapter 41, verse 32, when Pharaoh dreamed a dream, he dreamed 2 different dreams. And yet, what did Joseph tell him? Your dreams are one. No, Joseph, I had 2 dreams. No, that's not what Joseph meant. It wasn't that Joseph meant that you had only 1 dream. What did he mean?
One message, a complete stories here.
1 full message, okay, which is kind of an interesting combination of the 1 of unity and the 2 of the testimony and witness. You had 2 dreams that all meant the same thing. And that's what Pharaoh, when he dreamed, Joseph says, your dreams are one. There we see 2 cherubim placed on each side of the Ark of the Covenant in Exodus chapter 25, which is, even though in the text that meaning isn't displayed, we can kind of infer that understanding, because throughout the Old Testament, what 2 things were required in order to establish? Huh? Yeah, and testimony, right? Yeah, 2 people's testimony by the mouth of 2 or 3, let every word be what? Established. And that's even repeated as well in the New Testament. We see 2 tablets of stone on which the 10 Commandments and the law were given in Exodus 31. We have 2 testaments, Old and New Testaments. Hebrews chapter 10 and in verse 28, the Hebrew writer references the testimony of at least 2 witnesses. Revelation also talks about witnesses, and they are 2 in number, and specifically Revelation chapter 11, verses 3 and 4. And there are many other places, many other occasions where that number 2 kind of carries that weight with it as well, of referencing kind of solidity, of verifying something. And that's an important number to remember. Anything through that? All right, 3, complete. Something that is entire. Both 3 and 7 kind of carry that same meaning of something that is complete, but especially when we're talking about God or deity, something divine. We see how that after the flood, okay, Noah's 3 sons helped repopulate the earth. Of course, again, that specific meaning, we don't find that in the Genesis account, that's what 3 would represent, but it is interesting that there were 3 sons of Noah helped repopulate the earth with their wives. In Genesis chapter 22 and in verse 4, it was a 3-day journey to make the sacrifice. Again, that could have been coincidence, or it could have been deliberate, could have been on purpose. Genesis chapter 40, verses 9 through 19, we see the dreams of the cupbearer, the baker, and these dreams are filled with 3s over and over and over again. The Israelites, there were 3 major feasts that all required travel to Jerusalem. This is part of the reason why the Samaritans had such an issue, or not Samaritans, why Jeroboam, why he set up the high places, the 2 high places in both the north and south of Israel, so that they wouldn't have to go to Jerusalem for those feasts. But that's in Exodus chapter 23. Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish. Jesus, of course, he gave the sign. He said the only sign that this generation is going to be given is the sign of Jonah, and that was the fact that Jesus was in the ground for 3 days. And on the third day, he arose. Before Saul became a Christian, he was blinded for 3 days and then was baptized. We're talking about the deity, what we call the Godhead. The term Godhead, it's kind of interesting, especially with our younger people. They don't know that term because in the newer translations, that the term Godhead isn't in the newer translations. How is it translated in like the New King James? Instead of saying the Godhead, what does it say? The divine nature. Okay, the divine nature. So what we read, when we read divine nature, usually in the King James American Standard, it reads Godhead. But that's what it's referencing, is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The three that are one together. And so obviously the three, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are done, baptism's done in their name and their authority, representing that completeness as well. In Revelation, we have 3 woes pronounced by 3 angels bringing judgment on the world in Revelation chapter 8. Revelation chapter 9, there's 3 plagues killing 1/3 of mankind. New Jerusalem is having 3 gates on each side, complete unimpeded entry into the New Jerusalem. And so we're going to see the number 3 on several occasions in Revelation. And so when we see that, kind of carry with this in the back of our mind this sense of something that is complete, something that is united, certainly is a sense of it as well, but the idea of complete. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
That section also reminded me, that's not just a Bible thing. The whole world, culture after culture, really focuses in on 3. The
Yeah.
ancient Egyptians with the pyramid, many kid stories, 3 little pigs, and that's not an English story. That goes across the ocean and just over and over. Beth had the 3 witches. 3 keeps going from culture to culture.
Right, absolutely. And there are certain numbers within ancient cultures in our society that carry a lot of the same meanings as what we find in the Bible, which I suggest that it's because it was found in the Bible, and therefore it carries that meaning in our societies and even in ancient cultures as well. Yeah. All right, number 4, the number 4, how many directions are there?
360.
Well, yeah, shut up. North, south, east, and west, right? Never eat shredded wheat. Okay, we have 4 cardinal directions. And all of those represent the fullness of the earth, okay? Every direction, everywhere. The garden was surrounded by 4 great rivers. Not in any way that's metaphorical, that was literal. There was literally 4 rivers. But there's also that significance of the fact that this garden was so beautiful, and it represented the kind of the fullness of creation of God where Adam and Eve were placed. Then mankind goes about to all the world. In fact, there's the 4 corners of the earth. Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 12. In fact, the Psalms also references the 4 corners. Sometimes the 4 winds are referenced as well in Psalms. Ezekiel 37 also mentions the 4 winds. And then there's the 4 living creatures, each facing in a different direction, mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 1. Where else do we find reference to 4 living creatures? In Revelation. Yeah, Revelation chapter 4. Ironically, even though chapter headings are put in by man, so that wasn't, God didn't put chapter 4 there for that reason. But there are 4 living creatures, and they had faces on every side. How many faces did they have? 4. Okay, so, and this kind of represents that full all-seeing, that full encompassing, that full recognition of all these directions and everything that is happening. New Jerusalem has 4 sides, and of course we talked about the 3 gates, but it has 4 different sides representing every possible way, direction of all the people of the earth who are willing to submit to the Lord are welcome in Jerusalem. Thoughts or comments through 4? All right. 7. Now, obviously, it's not that there aren't numbers like 2 or 5 and 6, but 7, and we're going to talk about 6 in just a minute, but 7 is obviously the concept of completeness, as we talked about with 3, but also the sense of that which is finished, okay, that which is perfect. Often oaths are made in association in some form with number 7. Obviously, we talk about the creation of the heaven and the earth. Took 6 days plus on the seventh the Lord rested, so 7 total. Noah entered the ark. 7 clean animals were taken on board versus the 2 that were unclean. That we sometimes forget that. Sometimes I think there's some of our children's songs, 2 by 2, they entered in the ark. And they did, all the unclean animals. The clean animals, there were 7 that entered. The word 7 and the word oath in Hebrew are actually very, very similar, which is interesting because in Genesis chapter 21, verse 28 through 31, the difference of Sheva versus Shava, there's both of those concepts in Genesis 21, where the location of the name Beersheba, or Beersheba, we can say Beersheba, can be translated either the wells of 7 or the wells of an oath. And of course, there were 7 wells, and an oath was made in Beersheba. And so it's kind of a play on words, Beersheba there. It's representing both the oath and the wells that were dug in Genesis 21. And so it's kind of an interesting component of that as well. Jacob, he worked 7 years. He intended for Rachel, but who did he end up getting? Leah. And so he had to work 7 more years. So it's complete on top of complete. Obviously, it was literally 14 years, but there's still that kind of that representation as well. Solomon, when he describes his bride in the Song of Solomon, he lists 7 attributes and concluded that because of these 7 attributes, she was completely beautiful, without blemish. In fact, there's even, we'll talk in just a minute about references to Solomon by his bride as well. But in Pharaoh's dream, how many years of famine and how many years of plenty were there? 7. 7 years of famine, or 7 years of plenty, and then 7 years of famine. Again, those were literal years. It's not taking anything away from the literal nature of it. But again, whether they're literal or metaphorical, there's often meaning behind the usage of these numbers. 7s appear in the worship of God when we find in the New Testament. The lampstand contains 7 lamps in Exodus chapter 37 under the tabernacle. There were 7 lamps on the lampstand. When a sin offering was made, blood was sprinkled 7 times, Leviticus chapter 4 and verse 6. Again, representative of that completeness of offering to God, representative of that completeness of purity to God. When God emphasized punishment, sometimes it was 7-fold. We see in Leviticus chapter 26, on several occasions there, referencing 7 in verse 18, 21, 24, and 28. Referencing the punishment of God. And so sometimes that's associated with the concept of this complete punishment, this complete condemnation and judgment from God. All right, anything else through 7? Yes, sir.
These numbers, every time there's a number, like I discovered the 7 at the end of John,
Mm-hmm.
where Peter said, I'm going fishing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Who knows? But it can't be accident.
Right. Yeah.
And then they pull 200 and something fish out.
Yeah.
No one knows what that number is, but it's got to be something. Or
Could
we
be.
don't even
Yeah, could be. Yeah. Well, and of course, in Acts chapter 6, how many men did the apostles tell the disciples to choose to take care of the Grecian widows? 7. Okay. Again, literal 7. It's not in any way suggesting that all the numbers in the Bible are only symbolic or only metaphorical. And it's not to say that there aren't some times where maybe that number is used, that it could be just coincidence. But generally speaking, especially in places of prophecy, especially when we have a convergence of an abundance of examples of it being used in that certain way, that usually means something. And so that, and again, that kind of carries with it that meaning that we've been talking about. All right, so after 7, since 7 is perfect, what do you think 6 would be then? Not quite perfect. Okay, not quite perfect. 6 is imperfect. It becomes the number for sin and for man, especially in Revelation. But the Israelite week was divided into 6 days of labor for man, the 7th day dedicated to God, which we're familiar with. That's how we're set up as well. Half of 7 is 3.5, and this is the number used when something is incomplete and is associated with trials. For instance, in Luke chapter 4, verse 25, and of course, this is referenced as well in James, but Elijah He brought a drought on Israel, and then he prayed to God, and it would be done. It was 3 years and 6 months. Again, I think it was a literal 3 years and 6 months, but there's still that understanding that 3.5 seems to carry with it the sense of sin and trial and burden, and 6 is associated with that as well. And we're going to talk more about the concept of 6 in just a minute. Then you've got 10, which oftentimes represents a complete set or short time. In fact, we even talked about one instance of this number 10 in the book of Revelation in our Churches of Asia study. But God sent 10 plagues. Obviously, we're familiar with that. The law of Moses started with the 10 commandments. When the bride described her husband Solomon, she lists 10 qualities and concludes that he was wholly desirable compared to Solomon's, he references 7. She references 10. And one of the things that we talked about in Revelation was those who are going to be thrown into prison, Smyrna, the devil will try you for how many days? 10 days. Okay, not that that is intended to represent a literal 10 days, but it is meant to represent a set time. And that, you see this, or multiples of 10, and that's another component to this as well, 1,000 years, for instance. Okay, 10 is a multiple, or 1,000 is one of those multiples of 10, or 10 multiples of 1,000. And it represents kind of a set time upon a set time. Not necessarily a literal 1,000 years, just like it wasn't a literal necessarily 10 days that some of the saints are going to be thrown into prison. But it represents a time that God has set, or a time that God has established. And so 10 kind of represents that fullness of the time that God has put into effect. Any thoughts through that? All right. Now, there are a couple of numbers in particular that are going to pop up in Revelation that are going to have special significance as we read through Revelation. And one of these is the number 12. Okay, the number 12 represents the faithful, God's people. Certainly, Jacob had 12 sons from which we can receive the 12 tribes, right? What's interesting, though, is remember Joseph had 2 sons. What were his 2 sons' names? Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, remember Jacob actually ended up giving Ephraim and Manasseh Joseph's blessings, but the firstborn blessings. But Ephraim and Manasseh, even though they were technically, you would add them to it, there'd be 13 tribes. They were still considered 12 tribes because they came from Joseph. The apostles. Okay, we know that there were 12 apostles. Judas killed himself, making 11. Matthias was then added, making it 12. But then who else was added after that? Paul. So there were 13, technically, apostles, but it's always referenced as 12. Okay, it's not that Jesus, when the 12 apostles are referenced later, it's not that somehow one of them is being excluded or Paul's being kept out somehow. It's representative of the fullness of the apostles, just like the 12 tribes represented the fullness of Israel. In Revelation chapter 21, verses 12 through 14, you count the gates to the New Jerusalem. On 4 sides, there's 3 gates on each side, on every side. How many total? 12. 12 total gates. One for each of the 12 tribes. But it's not necessarily specific to the literal 12 tribes. It's representative of the people of God. There were 12 foundation stones, one for each of the 12 apostles, Revelation 21. The subdivision of 12 is 3 times 4, 3 being complete, that fullness of number, and then 4 representing all directions makes 12 the ideal number to represent all the people of God. Which, when you break that down and you think about the 4 sides, the 3 gates, and how that all people of God from every corner of the earth, all those who are willing to submit and obey, are represented by the number 12. But do you think it was an accident that God ensured that there were 12 sons of Jacob? Do you think it was an accident that there were 12 apostles? Okay, again, those numbers are literal. There were 12 tribes. There were 12 sons of Jacob. Okay, there were 12 apostles. But it also carries that meaning of that complete people of God. and what it represents. And I think what's really interesting and important about that too is the fact that you have that subdivision of 3 plus 4, or 3 times 4, that carries with it the sense that it's not the literal children of Abraham. We're not talking about the blood-related children of Abraham that are being referenced. It's all people from all the walks of earth who are the children of Abraham in the spirit, not in the flesh, those who submit to the promises of God. Anything through that? Yes, sir.
I noticed studying in the book of James, he uses a lot of references of the Old Testament. And unless you know and have read the Old Testament, you don't understand.
Right.
We don't know what a sacrifice is, but we do if we study the Old Testament.
Yeah.
We see how that's how God started things. And it helps us to do studies like what we're doing this morning, to understand things when we run across them like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
But if we looked at numbers or phrases or anything like that, that helps us to understand. It's like we're going through definitions
Right. Yeah.
of how, when we read anything that God has said, he relies heavily on what he's done in the past.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. 24. Okay, 24 is a number that pops up in Revelation a lot. What 24 represents would be the 12 tribes plus the 12 apostles, which represents the fullness of the dispensation of God. Okay, not that the Mosaical law was the only dispensation. There was the patriarchal law that Abraham had, that Adam and Eve had, whatever law that was. But the representation of all those before Jesus and all those after Jesus represents the fullness of everyone. And so Revelation mentions 24 elders. Those come up quite a bit. These elders, especially in the Old Testament as well in the New Testament, elders were leaders of the people of God. And certainly elders being established in the hierarchy of the authority of the church as well. And so if you combine the 12 tribes under the Old Law and the 12 apostles under the New Law, you get 24. And so when the 24 elders are referenced in the Old Testament, or in Revelation, it's referencing the fullness of the faithful under the Old and the faithful under the New. Thoughts or comments to that?
Yeah, I'll keep going. I'm trying not to raise my hand too much, but 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing.
That's a great point.
So many of these are
I didn't include that on there.
things
Yeah.
that they already knew then.
Yeah, that's a great point. 24 hours in a day. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. The number 40. 40 comes up a lot in the especially in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well, it comes up quite a bit. The flood, obviously, was one of the first things we think of when you think of 40 days and 40 nights. Children of Israel were sentenced to 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Jesus, how many days did he spend in the wilderness fasting before he was tempted by Satan? 40 days. Okay, 40 comes up a lot. And one other thing, and this is something that Homer Haley points out, is that the 40 is a combination of two other numbers, 4, which is everything everywhere, and 10, which is complete. And I thought that was kind of an interesting component. It represents this complete encompassing, usually in terms of a trial. Okay, Noah and the flood, that was a trial over all the earth. The children of Israel, it was a trial in the wilderness because of what they had done. Jesus was tried in the wilderness by by fasting in the wilderness before he was tempted by Satan. And so 40 carries with it that kind of that significance, especially of hardship, is usually attached to that as well.
Almost like a testing.
A testing. Yep, a testing.
Endure it 40 years.
Right. Yep. And multiples of 40 pop up from time to time as well. All right, 100. A lot in quantity or a long time, or multiples of 100. And again, what's the square root of 100? 10. Okay, so you carry with it that sense of that completeness as well. Proverbs 17, verse 10 tells us that 100 blows on the back of a fool won't cause him to learn. It's not that, well, maybe 101 will. Okay, he's using that kind of figuratively to say you can beat him all day, and it's not going to change anything. It's not going to help him. To describe someone who's greatly evil, Solomon says, though a sinner does evil 100 times, in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 12, he uses that term to kind of represent the fullness of evil. Not that 99 times isn't a fullness of evil, or 101 times is even more. It's the fullness of sin or fullness of evil. Ecclesiastes chapter 6 and verse 3, Solomon talking about the family. He says, if a man begets 100 children. Okay, well, I can't imagine bearing 100 children, but it's the idea of this fullness of family, this fullness of blessings from the Lord. Luke chapter 15 and in verse 4, there was how many sheep and one went astray? 100. Okay, the 99 and 1. And so Jesus uses that to represent kind of that same sense of fullness, that completeness as well. In time, in Isaiah chapter 65 and in verse 20, to describe someone living to an old age, an age span of 100 years is used. Not that it was literally people would live 100 years. People lived, a long time beyond 100 years early before the flood. And after the flood, it started going down quite a bit. But he describes the fullness of life, basically. 100 years is fullness of life. All right. Any thoughts through that?
Back on 40,
Yeah.
weren't the first three kings of Israel all in 40?
You're right. Absolutely. I hadn't thought about that one. Yeah, the first three kings of Israel. That's right. Good point. Thank you. Yeah, some of these I'm going to have to add. I have to add 24 days and the 40 years of the kings as well. All right. 666. Now, we talked about 6, the number kind of representing sin, incomplete, lack of perfection. 666, which is the number of man and the mark of the beast, is a commonly discussed number. It's something that people talk about all the time. Try to find various different combinations or find it in our modern society, 666, thinking that it'll represent the Antichrist. Incidentally, what term is never found in the book of Revelation? Antichrist is never found in the book of Revelation. Okay, but people associate it anyway. Revelation 13, verse 18 speaks of the number of the beast as being 666, and we're told that that's the number of man. Understand that if 6 is something that is incomplete and sinful, and that is associated with man, 3 sixes, what does 3 represent? Complete, unified. Okay, so 3 sixes would kind of represent the fullness of sin. Okay, the complete fullness, the complete disregard of all things that are godly and holy. It's completely disregarding that which is pure. And obviously, the idea is something that's completely full of sin. Thus, it makes sense that the beast of false worship in Revelation 13 would carry the number 666. And so it's not that 666 has some kind of magical meaning or that there's some sort of literal interpretation of that number that we should take from it. It's just the concept of 6 being sinful, incomplete, time, or have it 3 times, 666. It just represents that fullness of how evil and how sinful those who follow after the beast, those who follow after sin and after evil, that's kind of representation of their state. Thoughts or comments through that? That's a lot of bad. Yeah, it's a lot of bad. All right, 1,000. Again, 1,000, you got 10, you got 100. 1,000, all in quantity or in a remaining time. Okay, now sometimes 10 may represent a set time, but it may be a short amount of time. 100 may be a little bit more than 10, so it's still a set time, but maybe it's a little bit longer period of time. And 1,000 may be much longer period of time, but it's still not literal. It's meant to represent an understanding of the time that God has allotted, whatever time that may be. And it's not necessarily in the range of 1,000 years. It's not going to be give or take 1,000 years. It's however long God has said it's going to be. In Psalm 50 and verse 10, there's 1,000 hills, the cattle on the hill of 1,000 hills. Well, the cattle belong to the Lord, the hills belong to the Lord, and all of them are all that quantity, all of that belongs to God. 1,000 years is used to describe a very long time in Psalms 90 and in verse 4. Forever is compared to 1,000 generations in Psalm 105 and in verse 8. Peter tells us that what is as a day, and a day as 1,000 years. Okay, I've had Christians who tried to argue that that's literal, that therefore we're to interpret the 6 days in the Old Testament as 6,000 years, and basically Peter was giving us kind of the key there to understand that creation took 6,000 years. And I'm like, why? Why would you even think that? Why? And it doesn't make any sense at all, because that's not Peter's point. Peter's simply saying that what? God doesn't abide by what? by our sense, our perspective, our perception of time. God is eternal. God is ageless. Okay, therefore, a day is no different than 1,000 years to God. 1,000 years is no different than a day. Okay.
God didn't recognize time. He created time.
He created time. Yeah. And being in a spiritual realm, there would be no according of time. Okay. God set that in the physical realm. Time exists in our physical realm, not in the spiritual. Now, trying to wrap your head around eternity and what exactly does it mean that God had no beginning? Everything has a beginning, and yet God had no beginning. Trying to wrap your head around that will give you a headache. But this is how we understand the difference, especially from the spiritual to the physical as well. And so 1,000 is that all in quantity or in the sense of the time that God has allotted as well. 144,000. Okay, now we get to the 144,000 that's referenced in Revelation chapter 14, verse 33, the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. But remember that, again, we have a combination. We've got 12 times 12 times 1,000. All right, now I want you to think about that. If we said that 12 and 12 is 24, and 24 represents what? All the people of God. Okay, both under the Old Testament who were faithful, and all those who have come since, after Christ, who were faithful to the Lord. Everyone represented especially by that number 24. Times 1,000, which represents this full, complete fullness, this complete establishment of either boundaries or time that God has allotted. 2 12s are God's people, both under the Old and New Testament. 1,000 is used to mean all, or this complete time or completeness that God has established. Thus, 144,000 is all of God's people that have been faithful, ever, or will ever be. Okay, it's not a literal 144,000. So keep in mind that after Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, okay, Moses states in Numbers chapter 11 that you've given me 700,000 men that were capable of fighting in Numbers chapter 11. Okay, 700,000 men. That's not including women and children. So you got to figure, as of Numbers 11, there were probably at least 1.2, 1.3 million people. Okay, and probably more than that. Probably a lot more than that, actually. Maybe more like 2 million. So you got to figure, okay, not to say that all those were faithful to God and ultimately will be redeemed, but 144,000 only represents a small fraction of them. Then you got to factor in all the people who lived up until Jesus, and then all the Christians who've lived since. Is 144,000 literally going to be enough to cover all the people that are going to heaven? No. And thankfully, honestly, I mean, we have 8 billion people, almost 8 billion people living on this earth right now. We have no idea how many billions have lived before us. To think that only 144,000 would get to be saved would be, I mean, even more depressing than thinking, how sinful our society is. But recognizing that God's people are represented by that number, 144,000. Whether it's 1 million or 2 million, 3 million, however many millions are going to get to go to heaven, it's represented by that number. It's 12 times 12 times 1,000. Thoughts or comments to that? All right. Numbers take their meaning from the events that they're associated with. We see this over and over again, a lot of repetition in this as well. And as I mentioned, the numbers aren't always made clear. God is described as him who is, who was, and is to come in Revelation 1 verse 4. Well, what do we have there? What number do we see? 3. Representing the past, the present, and the future. And then add to that both the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all mentioned at verse 4, verse 5, verse 6. You have 3, and then 3 again. Okay, so these numbers, sometimes they're not going to be obvious. Sometimes you have to look in the text and in the context and see what's being talked about, but then sometimes it'll pop out. And so carry that with you as well. And just to make it clear, because numbers are being used for their meaning, it would be a mistake to take a number from Revelation and conclude that it's a literal value without careful consideration. The 7 churches of Asia, okay, those were literal letters being written to those literal churches. Those are 7 churches. And I want to emphasize that. But, having said that, it is notable that there were other churches in Asia. There were 2 other churches, at least within stone's distance of the last one that we talked about, Thyatira. Laodicea, sorry, Laodicea. Okay, but the fact that 7 churches are addressed carries with it what meaning? It's a sense of completeness. This is not, it wasn't just to those 7 churches. It was to all God's people. Okay, those 7 churches were not going to be the only churches where brethren were going to have to suffer and deal with the trials that they were facing that Jesus is addressing. But those 7 churches represented the broader body of Christ. And so those 7 churches were addressed. Those 7 churches were specifically certain things that had to be addressed. But the fact that there are 7 is notable. Context, as always, dictates if a number should be taken literally or figuratively. Either one can still indicate meaning and symbolism. Okay, and so just because something is literal, there's literal 12 tribes, there's literal 12 apostles and so forth, doesn't mean that there's not some meaning attached to it. All right, any thoughts through that? Go ahead, Ms. Ruby.
It seems to me that just listening that there's an awful lot of fullness and completeness
Yes.
being discussed.
And I think that's a great point, Mr. Ruby, because that really brings up an interesting aspect because there's so much of that in Revelation. Okay, and the book of Revelation, as we're going to talk about here in just a minute with the introduction, it's all meant as, really the book of Revelation is a letter of love and encouragement from the Lord to his people. Okay, his people who are going to be dealing with they're already dealing with great persecution and will continue even more so in the decades to come that Jesus is addressing. And he wants his people to remain faithful. He wants his people to remain firm in their trust and assurance that God will take care of this. In the fullness of time, God's will is going to be done, and you're going to be vindicated. You're going to be justified. You focus on remaining faithful till death. God will take care of the rest. That's what Revelation is all about. And the fact that these numbers pop up so often carries that sense of understanding that this is all designed to kind of steel the brethren to face these trials and to be faithful through them. All right. Anything else through that? Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Doug.
When's the number not a real number?
When's the number not a real number?
God used the reference of sands of the sea.
Yeah.
And that's a number that's not a real
It's not a real number. That's true. It's infinite. Yeah.
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 You know, I think you used that as reference to the promises from Abraham.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, I think of the blessings that we have. I think they're like the sand of the sea.
Yeah.
No way to count.
To count them all. Yeah.
We think as time goes on, we grow smarter, we get more intelligent, we find out things about what God has created that we didn't even know.
Right.
We didn't understand science like we do.
Right.
So,
Well, like the ocean having its circuits. Yeah.
I'm thinking, what is there even more that God has done that we
Don't even realize. Yeah.
That falls into that sand of the sea
Yeah.
situation.
Good point. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Good point. All right. All right. Well, we finished the numbers of Revelation. We will pick up with the introduction to Revelation. We'll plan on finishing this introduction as well as the second part to the introduction next Sunday. And so then we'll be able to get into Revelation 1 after that. So make sure either on your way out, I also emailed them out to everybody, but on your way out, there's 2 different stacks back here on this back table, both punched already and ready to go in your binder, the introduction part 2 and Revelation 1 verses 1 through 8. Thank you, everybody.